Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution for tonight's talk, and also welcome those of you joining us online, of whom there are quite a number. My name is Joe Houlihan. I'm a board member here at the BRLSI, and I also run and organise our military history programme. If this is your first visit to the institution, you'll be pleased to know that you're taking part in a 200-year or a near 200-year tradition of attending, stimulating and entertaining talks at this institution. Next year, in fact, is our 200th anniversary, our bicentenary, 2024, and I would encourage you to look out for some of the events we'll be doing next year to celebrate that special occasion. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, please bear with me for the fun bit of the evening, which is the housekeeping. Firstly, in the highly unlikely event of there being an emergency, please exit calmly back down the main staircase and out through the front door, the way you came in, basically. Once you're outside, turn right. When you get to the corner, turn right again onto Chapel Row, and the muster point is that little grassy area by the temple ornament. If for any reason it's not possible to exit through the front of the building, just follow the emergency exit signs, and there are other exits at the rear of the building. Secondly, for those of you taking part in tonight's event on Zoom, please make sure that you are muted and that your video function is turned off during the talk. We would love to hear from you, but only after the talk is finished. You can, of course, post questions in the Zoom chat, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. Right, now we get to the good bit and the reason you're all here. I'm delighted to welcome tonight's speaker, Al Murray. We all know Al as a wonderfully talented comedian whose Pub Landlord character is, I think, rapidly taking on the status of national treasure. Tonight, however, he's wearing a different hat as a historian, although I don't know what kind of hat a historian wears, but anyway. Al studied modern history at Oxford. He's written books on the subject and presented documentaries. He co-hosts with James Holland the hit history podcast, We Have Ways of Making You Talk, which is a really excellent podcast. They've been running a series of talks this year during 2023 based on letters from participants in the Second World War, and they're very informative and very, very moving at times. And that's available, obviously, wherever you get your podcast from. His most recent book, and the subject of tonight's talk, is called Command: How the Allies Learned to Win the Second World War. The book is an impeccably researched reappraisal of some of the most consequential Allied military leaders of World War II, from George S. Patton and Bernard Montgomery to the mercurial Ord Wingate, who was once a hero of mine, based on a book I read in my teens, but Al has kind of destroyed that now. He commanded the Chindits in Burma, for those that don't know. And Percy Hobart, whose unusual tank designs played a big role in the invasion of Normandy. Historian Saul David has described the book as quirky, original and hard-hitting, as enjoyable to read as it is instructive. Another reviewer called it deeply incisive. Each paragraph brings a new revelation, and I can attest to that. Some of you may already have bought a signed copy. Unfortunately, at the end of the talk and after the questions, Al has to make a fairly speedy getaway to get the train back to London, but there are additional signed copies. I think there are some left for anyone who wants to pick up a copy after the event. So, on that note, please give a generous welcome to Al Murray.
Good evening. Say hello to the nerds on Zoom. I'm roughly here. Office. Don't worry, I've worked in TV. Office. There we go. That about does it. Right, okay. Hello. Good evening. Thank you very much for joining me. This evening, a pleasure to be back in Bath. I used to come here regularly when I was a kid. My grandparents lived up on Zion Hill, and we'd walk down the golf course down to where the toy shops were, and I'd persuade my grandmother to buy me Spitfires. Now, in the model shop. So it's lovely to be back in a beautiful evening and a fascinating place to be. I've been downstairs in the basement and looked at various knob kerries and things for smashing your brains in that came from the South Pacific, which is excellent, and bayonets and things, and tiny pistols. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about my book, Command. Now, this is the first one of these I've done just as a talk. Normally, I'm chaired by someone, right? And they've read the book, and they go, so tell me, how did you come up with why have you written this book? So what I thought I'd do is bastardise that. And I get asked the same questions every time. And they seem to be the questions that are a good way to explain the book. So what I'm going to do is posit the question, and then when I've answered it, I'll move on to the next subject, really, because that seems a good way of addressing the book and what the book's about. I'm going to move about. The camera doesn't stand a chance. A good way of addressing what the book's about, why I'm interested in the subject, how I arrived at it, and also, frankly, you're all polite and nice people, but the ball ache of writing a book a year ago, which I don't remember very much of, and then asked to talk about, and also the fact that once you've written it and it's on paper, you then start thinking of counter-arguments, or counter-arguments come at you, different ways of looking at the thing that's now in paper in black and white come at you. I'm fortunate in that I am not a historian, as I see it. I'm a consumer of James Holland is a historian. James Holland is the trawler. I'm the person who likes eating fish and chips, right? So I feel I have complete carte blanche to say, actually, no, I got that wrong. I've been thinking about that the last 6 months, and I think that's actually the other way round. I'm not A.G.P. Taylor. It doesn't matter. And also, the really important thing about history is you do change your mind. It does move on. You do literally rewrite history. History is there to be rewritten, which is one of the most stupid arguments that's been going on in our newspapers in recent years, is that you don't rewrite history. You only rewrite history because you're only ever coming at it with your current perspective. So we'll start with if that makes sense. Now, before I ask myself the first question, who is a regular listener to the podcast? Show of hands. Only a few. That's pretty good, right? So that's new people to hopefully persuade to listen. And do we have any actual independent company members who are the sort of absolute diehards? One. Brilliant. Okay, that's okay. There we go. I've done my marketing research. Right. So the first question is, and I always get asked this, why are you so interested in the Second World War? Right? Because after all, I am a comedian. I've made my living as a comedian for more than 30 years now. I play a character. I don't play myself. So what does anyone really know about what I think about anything? And I've actually made a point of doing that, because I'm not necessarily interested in people being interested in what I think. But the reason I'm interested in the Second World War, or the reasons, are really they're sort of twofold. And the first is the time I grew up in. I was born in 1968. I grew up in the 1970s with Action Man. I remember my dad buying me my first Airfix Mark 9 Spitfire, the Johnny Johnson one that sort of clips together, really, doesn't glue together. I remember that. I remember painting them and putting them on the boiler in the kitchen to try and get them to dry faster, and the house smelling of enamel. I remember all that. And I remember watching the Battle of Britain movie for the first time on television, or maybe even in the cinema, and having funny feelings about Susanna York. I remember all of that, and the Second World War for me as a small boy, Victor, warlord comics. The Second World War was being offered to us as children as this incredible adventure, the most amazing adventure. And not only that, an adventure in which we were the good guys and had triumphed, very often pluckily and against the odds, although more on that in a minute. So I grew up with that as a small boy, but also in the background was the fact that my mother never knew her father, because he was killed in Hazebrouck at the end of May in 1940 with the Bucks Battalion, 1st Bucks Battalion, who were a territorial battalion, the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry. He was the adjutant in that battalion. There were 2 professional soldiers in the Bucks Battalion out of a complement of something like, I think, 750 men when they went up to the deal line, and that hung in the family too. Yes, there was the 7-year-old's idea of the Second World War, which is this tremendous adventure with Spitfires zooming through the air and the sound of Merlins, and maybe you'd get to Duxford and you'd get to look at one and that sort of stuff. But there was also the fact that there was the effect of the war on my mother and my grandmother, because my grandmother had lost her husband and her brother, he was killed. He was a major in I think he was a company commander in the Gloucesters, and was killed fighting around Pinway in Burma in late 1944. So the Second World War was the thing I grew up with as a sort of as the thrill ride, but also as you get older and you get to grips with it, the consequence of the thing, what the thing actually amounts to, and how, yes, it's planes swooping through the sky, and it's kit, and it's tanks, and it's gear, and all the sort of things that you know, I know grown men and women too can still be hung up on, but it's also how it affects people's lives on the absolute granular, atomized level. Your family, your uncle, your mother's uncle and her father both lost. So that's why the war is such a profoundly fascinating subject. And my father, he is fascinated with the Second World War, and so he would take me to Duxford. He would take me to see A Bridge Too Far, for instance, in the cinema. And the reason we went to see A Bridge Too Far is he'd been an airborne engineer, so he'd worn a red beret, but he'd been a sapper, as a parachutist. And so he'd gone to the cinema to see what they were saying about his people, basically, because he knew several of the actual protagonists who'd fought at Arnhem Bridge. And of course, halfway through the film, he got very upset that it was the wrong tank. It was a Leopard tank, not a Tiger tank. And that moment has stayed with me since 1977. Anyway, the key importance of pedantry during war movies. So that's why I'm interested in the topic. I felt, as I was growing up, that it was completely unavoidable. We didn't go to football matches. We didn't do football. That wasn't our thing. We would go to Pegasus Bridge at Normandy on the holidays. Or we did one year go to Waterloo, which wasn't anything as interesting. That's what we did. That was the culture that we had in our family. So when I came to doing a history degree and had to do the Tudors for a third time in my short life, I very much went off history and wasn't much interested in it. The only really interesting bit I found in my degree is when we looked at the Foreign Office telegrams and cabinet papers in the 3 years running up to the Second World War. So you'd read what Eden was writing to Chamberlain about what he thought of Mussolini and all that sort of stuff. And that was all pretty interesting. And then long, boring cabinet meetings about how many Spitfires they were going to order. And you had to know, you know, what it meant when they were ordering them in March of 38 compared to March of 39. And they mean different things at the time. Anyway, but Second World War went away, but it came back very much with meeting James Holland and doing We Have Ways of Making You Talk, doing the podcast, and talking about the Second World War probably twice a week, every week, and sometimes 3 times a week, sometimes 5 times a week, during the pandemic. And it was during the pandemic that the idea for this book came together, because I've always kept up with the reading and I've always sort of tried to keep track. And the central idea in the book, I think, reflects kind of there's very much a school of thought about the Second World War that is hard to disagree with, really hard to argue with. And that school of thought is that it is a war of economies and industries. And after all, and Richard Overy wrote a book in the 90s, a classic text called Why the Allies Won. And what he basically says is, Germany takes on, in its bid to become an imperium, to become an empire in Europe, Germany takes on 3 other empires, each of which is larger economically than itself. So the United Kingdom is not the United Kingdom, it's the British Empire, with the United Kingdom as its imperial centre. And on the podcast, we've come to calling that Duke, so Dominion's UK Empire, as an acronym that sort of tries to contain the size and scale and complexity of the British Empire, because after all, what the British could draw from Australia was different from what they could get out of New Zealand, South Africa, India, Canada. But the essential principle that Britain comes with 450 million people attached, if you take it on globally, and has done for the last 150 years, essentially, is the roughly 120 years. That's the problem that the Germans are running into there. The Soviet Union, literally the name of the Soviet Union implies it's a union of states, and the United States of America. So, and the US, of course, does have an empire, even though it doesn't have an empire. Americans would stoutly argue they didn't have an empire, but they did have an empire in the Philippines. So the point is, the argument goes, these three bigger conglomerations, each of which is either equal to or surpassing Germany's industrial capacity and ability, is all brought to bear, and bar the shooting, the outcome's inevitable. That the minute the ball gets rolling in 1939, Germany has lost. It's just a matter of time. It's a matter for these sort of materialistic forces to come into play. And Phillips, Payson O'Brien has recently written a book which makes this point, it's reiterating this point about how the Allied effort, and particularly the Western Allied effort in air and sea, is the thing that wins the Second World War. And if you look at the land fighting, you're sort of looking in the wrong place for where the industrial centre of gravity is in the Second World War. And the example he gives of that is that the German industrial production for tank production at its height is probably 3% of the German economy. You might imagine it would be more than that. And it's 45% of the German war production goes on fighter aircraft to defend themselves from the Allied bomber offensive. So when people say, oh, the bomber offensive doesn't really achieve anything, what it does is it totally distorts all of German industry's efforts to defend itself from that bomber offensive. So it disrupts German industry. So it does its job. So that's the end of the bomber command argument. There we go. But the problem is with this argument is and it's a materialistic argument, it's arguably an argument that has Marxist roots, that it's based around materialism, essentially, around stuff and economy, is it leaves the people out. And, I'm going to pluck some figures as we go, and if you'll forgive me, I refer to the book, because, like I said, I haven't read it since the proof editor shredded it this time last year. And it's a war of engines. That's the way of looking at the Second World War. And Stalin makes this point. He makes this point in a speech at the celebration meeting of the Moscow Soviet of Working People's Deputies and Moscow Party and Public Organisations, right? Which sounds like a laugh riot, right? And he says this on the 6th of November 1941. So when the Soviet Union is really up to its neck in trouble, when the Germans are at the gate at Moscow, he says, this is a war of engines. It is impossible to have too many of them. And the side with the largest number of engines is bound to win. Now, he says that when the Soviet Union, and many accounts you read of the tides of the Second World War, late 1941, the Soviet Union is really in the shit, right? And looks like it might fail and lose. But Stalin's saying that breezily like that. And one of the main achievements of the Russian Revolution in the 20s and 30s is to industrialise Russian on a mass production basis, guided by the Americans who show them how to do it. So they are set up for mass production. If only they can buy themselves the time and move their factories behind the Urals, they'll get mass production up in a way that the Americans have. The British and German economies operate on a similar principles where they don't have full, proper mass production. They have artisan mass production. So that's why every Spitfire, the rivets are in a different place. And if you go to a Spitfire restoration place, they'll say, well, obviously Doris was on and she'd had enough. It was a Friday afternoon, and the rivets are all out of line, and every single rivet will go in a different place. Whereas on a Mustang, the equivalent, roughly, the rivets were all done on a template, and they're actually mass-produced, whereas Spitfires are kind of mass-produced. And the Germans are doing that too, and never effectively reach mass production. So the raw numbers of this go as follows, right? American industry produced 62.5% of the trucks that the Allies used, right? Some 2,328,311, right? It's absolutely boggling. And this is, the Americans have no army to speak. They have about 100,000 people in their army in 1939 and produced 18 tanks in 1939. But by the end of the war, have produced nearly 2.5 million trucks, right? German production is 2 million less than that, right? The Germans flat out produced 345,914 trucks. So the Germans don't even get close, right? And they're using horses, of course, for everything, which is one of the things that the Germans use horses. So maybe they don't need the trucks, but there's your a direct comparator, right? The USSR doesn't bother making trucks because it's getting them from the States. So makes 257,000 trucks. It doesn't need to make them because that's one of the reasons the Americans are making so many is they're supplying them by Lend-Lease to the UK and to the Soviet Union. Right? This supply of trucks frees up the Soviets to make tanks, which is the thing they need more than anything else. And the Soviets produce 105,521 tanks in the Second World War because their steel has been freed up to do that, which is twice the amount produced by the Germans, right, and equal to British and American tank production combined. Right, so if this is a war of economies and a war of machines, you can see that the argument that it's over before it's even started, or over once the decisions have been made to go into mass production, it's over. But this doesn't include the people. And I see the stuff as the hardware and the people as the software, because people, after all, you can blow up a truck and you don't have to write home to its family, right? The people are made of the soft, squishy, irreplaceable stuff. Trucks aren't. And in the end, what the Allies have to do, this book, Command, is about how the Allies go from a diabolical losing streak, an absolutely terrible losing streak, to, by the end of the war, being essentially unstoppable, and unstoppable against an ideologically motivated enemy who is prepared to fight to literally the last round to preserve the fatherland. And they're difficult enemies to fight. So the question comes in, how do the Allies get themselves in such a pickle in the first place where they have no answer to the Germans? That's the first question. And the second question is, how do they then turn that round? And then then the illustration is, what's that like? How does that work? And how do you actually prosecute that kind of war? So that's the pitch of the book, if that makes sense. And the next question I'm normally then asked is, so what form does the book take? And what I've got is 10 people, 10 characters from the war, some of whom are very, 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 very famous, and some of whom you'll have never heard of, hopefully. So it's Bernard Law Montgomery, but in 1939, when he's not Monty yet, when he's not a superstar, where he's not wearing 2 badges, where he hasn't delivered the only decisive Allied victory of the Second World War at that point. He's none of those things. He's a divisional commander. He's just like all the other major generals, or is he, right? And importantly, what he's up to in 1939, how he fits, what the army's like, what the BEF's like. Then Bernard Freyberg, who's a New Zealand general, although he's British, but he's from New Zealand, so to speak, which just shows how sort of the imperial setup means you can, if you've got a law degree from Wellington, you can practice law in London and vice versa. And so there's a whole set of people who rotate in and out of London with essential complete freedom of movement within the army, within politics, within industry and everything. And he's one of those people. And what happens to him in Crete, which isn't good. Then there's a fellow called Major General Francis Tuker, who's commanding officer 4th Indian Division in North Africa, and then up to the Casino Battle, and then went back to India and fought as a corps commander temporarily in 1945. And he's a really interesting man because he was an intellectual soldier, and very much saw himself as an intellectual. Then Ord Wingate, who Joe touched on earlier, who conceived and commanded the Chindits. And he demonstrates the state of the British Army's flexibility in trying out new ideas and/or its porousness to lunatics. Then there's Bill Slim, who is sort of the antithesis of the Wingate approach. Omar Bradley, because I felt I had to write about a couple of Americans. The past is a foreign country, as they say, but at least the Second World War was in English, right? They speak it's a foreign country, but at least they speak the same language as us. And America's kind of double. And I feel I confidently know my way around the British class system, know where people sit in it. The American one's quite different. So I investigate, have a look at Bradley and Patton, who chart very different courses in the war and offer very different characters in the war, but come from basically the same fundament, which is a really, really tiny American army. Then a fellow called Alistair Pearson. So then, and then Padley, then Bradley, then Patton, then a fellow called Alistair Pearson, who was a battalion commander in 6th Airborne Division and fought in Normandy, fought in North Africa in 1st Parachute Brigade, and then moved over to 6th Airborne and was one of the core people brought in to prepare the airborne assault on the Allied left flank on D-Day. And he's a very interesting man because he clearly, when he became a battalion commander, reached his ceiling, and that was the thing he was brilliant at. There was no way he'd ever got any further, but he was exactly the right person. Perfect square peg, square hole. And then a fellow called Percy Hobart, who everyone will have heard of. If you've a glancing knowledge of D-Day, you'll have heard of Hobart's funnies, which are the specialised armour tanks, things with flails on, or flamethrowers, or that roll bobbins, or can swim, all these mad designs that we use for the D-Day assault. But I think he's been looked at the wrong way round, and maybe we'll have time to get to that. And then Peter White. And Peter White, no one's ever heard of, unless you've read his memoir, a book called With the Jocks, was a platoon commander in 4th Kingsland Scottish Borderers in 52nd Lowland Division, who fought from October, November to the end of the war, 44 to May 45. And he wrote an absolutely amazing memoir about what it was like keeping an infantry platoon going. The last half of that book is just about April 1945, about what it was like fighting for the last 5-6 weeks, not knowing that the Germans were done, but knowing that they weren't going to give up. And the business of never knowing what's round the corner. And how he keeps himself together morally is a really interesting sort of right at the bottom, at the granular level thing. So we've got big picture people, we've got people at the bottom. Now, the question I get asked now, how did you choose these people? Well, some of them because they're marquee names, and, you know, I'm writing a piece of popular history, and if you're going to write about command in the Second World War, you've got to include Montgomery or Patton. But then other people, just because I followed my nose, the people I thought were going to be interesting, the people I thought I might have something to say about within my, purview as a comedian turned historian. Right. So the point is, we're looking at the software, the people, and we're looking at the attitudes of the institutions, the armies that win the war for the Allies. And it's all armies, this, by the way, as well, because it's boots on the ground where in the end you have to win. And the air assists with that, Navy assists with that, but in the end it's having fellows in khaki in Berlin that is the thing that spells the end for the Third Reich. So I start off with Montgomery, and I'll declare a sort of, not an interest, but I'll declare my sort of, I have a lot of sympathy for Montgomery because he's become one of those people he's an easy target. He was a difficult man. He was a prig by all accounts, although the other way around of looking at it is, because I think he possessed quite an impish, dry humour. But if you don't like him, you read it on the page, you think, well, this guy's a git. Whereas if you understand that he's joking and that it's his wry way of talking about things, actually you can see quite a lot of the humour in the man and the grease in the way he dealt with people that he trusted. And one of the interesting things about Montgomery is the people who weren't part of his circle didn't like him, but the people who were within his orbit and who he did get along with adored him. And his men, in general, if they didn't think he was ridiculous, which is always the risk he ran, if they didn't think he was ridiculous, thought he was okay, liked him, trusted him, had confidence in him, which is, after all, the key attribute that a man in his position needs, is people to have confidence in him and the decisions he's making. But I write about Montgomery in 1939, because Monty, in 1939, he's commanding 3rd Division. He's not top tier. He's someone with a reputation for talking shop in the mess. He's taught at the staff college, so he's very well connected, but people don't necessarily like him. He's seen as a bit dry and as a bit of a try-hard, and a professional through and through, and the kind of person that really in peacetime no one's much interested in. But he's thinking an awful lot about training. He writes an infantry manual. He's very much integrated into how the army does stuff, but it's not like anyone likes him much. And part of what happens is his wife dies of she's bitten by an unidentified insect and they cut her leg off, and then they cut the rest of her leg off, and then she dies of the infection. And he shuts down emotionally completely and becomes completely narrow, one-eyed about being a good officer and trying to do the best for his men. And this puts him in a position of extreme contrast with the BEF, with the organisation he's part of. So the British Expeditionary Force goes to France in 1939, once war's declared. The TA is sort of inflated like an absurd balloon, suddenly pumped up to much bigger than its planned size. The army has an influx of all these people with no kit, no uniforms, all this sort of stuff, and it drives the army to distraction, the fact that the TA has been massively expanded. And what to do with the men in the winter of 1939 as the nights are getting longer and there's no proper training program, there's no impetus from the Allies to attack the Germans, because that's after all the story of the first sort of 8 months of the war is the British and French don't do anything. The French go into Saumur and come out 48 hours later or something. There's no offensive planning at all by the Allies, by the Western Allies. And that never was what they were going to do. They were going to get the Germans to come onto them in the style of 1418 and beat them again in the style of 1418. That was the plan. Heavy blockade, extension of the blockade through strategic bombing, get the Germans to come to you, defeat them in place, in situ. But what this means is you've got a lot of blokes who aren't necessarily soldiers, who haven't got anything to do, and are idle. And so Montgomery becomes concerned with VD. Now, the reason he's concerned with VD is he was a staff officer in the First World War. He was injured in 1914, shot through the lungs in 1914, left out for dead. A sergeant, I think, ran out to rescue him and was killed and lay on top of him, died on top of him. And he was left out all night and then was finally brought in the morning. And the story is a grave was dug for him, but that might be Montgomery, might be his version of events. We don't know, because his memoirs are quite unreliable in what's in them, but they're a very reliable guide to what he's like. I mean, they're a fantastic character assassination by himself. But VD in the First World War it becomes an actual national emergency. This is the thing that doesn't come into the story of the First World War, sort of poppies and the pointlessness. I'm sure if any of you have an impression of the First World War of the Western Front, it's trench foot is a big problem, right? Now the British Army, I think, goes through something like 4.5 million men in the First World War, something like that, and they hospitalise 74,711 men for trench foot. Right? Sounds like a lot of people. But they hospitalise 416,891 people with VD. Right? So the First World War in the popular imagination might be the war of mud and trench foot, but for the Tommy, it's getting laid. And because you're young, you don't want to die a virgin, all those things. And it reaches the problem gets magnified back in the UK because men take it home with them, they give it to their wives or their girlfriends, and it reaches an epidemic proportions in the UK. And there's a moral panic about it as well, because there's the two schools of thought. There's the sort of Puritan school of thought that says, well, then we better not ever mention sex, can't talk about it. If we even mention it or say that men are going to do it, then they'll do it. And then there's the other end where people are trying to give out condoms and are trying to do something sort of practical about it, and they're seen as immoral and encouraging lewd behaviour. Venereal disease is seen as basically a gateway to Bolshevism. And one of the Pankhursts goes on about how it demonstrates the innate moral decay of the working classes, because they may have been getting votes for women, they weren't very nice people. Right? So there's all these mad First World War currents around venereal disease. And we're talking about syphilis as well. We're not talking about, chlamydia or our pathetic 21st century venereal disease, HIV aside. But we're talking about gonorrhea, syphilis, which is this disease that reprises in later life. You go mad. It comes up in great lumps and on your body. It's absolutely horrible. You can give it to your children if you infect your wife and she has children, you can give it to the children. It's the scourge of the 19th century. And everyone knows this in 1914-18. And if you're a staff officer in the British Army, if you're a brigade major, you know that your brigades are dealing with this. And the other thing about this figure is it's an offence in the British Army to have VD. So this is the 416,891 men who turned themselves in, who had to see a medical officer, right? So God knows. What we do know is that the Canadian Army, so this is a kind of 1 in 10 rate in the British Army. In the Canadian Army, it's 1 in 4 men. It's a 25% VD rate in the Canadian Army, but they're paid 5 times as much as British soldiers. So one of the solutions is, if you want to keep VD down, you pay your soldiers less. But anyway. So Montgomery arrives in France in 1939, thinking, my men have got time on their hands. They're young and they're young, dumb, and they're full of cum, or however you would want to see it. And we're back in Flanders, we're back in the bit of France where we were before. And there's a thing that goes on at this point in the BEF's history where, people go back to the old battlefields and look at where they fought in 1418. They go to the Menin Gate, they go and look at their old stomping grounds, going, isn't it ghastly we're back here, old boy? They're all saying that to each other. And Montgomery's mind turns to venereal disease, because he knows, especially as the men are inactive, that this is going to be a real problem. So on the 15th of November 1939, he writes a divisional memo to the officers in the division about VD. And here we go. Subject, prevention of venereal disease, Divisional Order 179A, 15th November 39, List A. I am not happy about the situation regarding venereal disease in the division. Since the 18th of October, the number of cases admitted to field ambulances in the divisional area totals 44. Right, so there he is, he's setting out his stall. I consider that the whole question of women, VD, and so on, is one which must be handled by the regimental officer, in particular by the CO. So he's saying it can't be left to us at division. It's got to go down into the battalions and at the battalion level. So at the sort of eye-to-eye level, this needs to be dealt with. My view is that if a man wants to have a woman, let him do so by all means, but he must use his common sense and take the necessary precautions against infection. Otherwise, he becomes a casualty by his own neglect, and this is helping the enemy. Right? So he's worried about his men's health. He wants an effective fighting formation, but what he's not doing is going, so whatever you do, tell them not to have sex, because he knows that won't work. Because he's been a regimental officer, he understands how this works. So then he talks about French letters. He says, the man who has a woman in a beetroot field near his company billet will not walk a mile to the battalion early treatment room. Right? So the idea was, after you'd done the deed, you went and had your nether regions wiped with iodine or something, and that would prevent venereal disease. Right? And then there's the 2 sentences that get him into incredible trouble. Right? And bearing in mind, Montgomery is the last person in the British Army before the Second World War to run a combined amphibious exercise for landing on a hostile shore. Right? Army haven't been practicing that, because the last time they did that was Gallipoli, and they've had to have a bit of a rethink. Right? And he's the last person that's run one of these things. Right? At brigade level when he does it. He says there are in Lille a number of brothels which are properly inspected and where the risk of infection is practically nil. These are known to the military police, and any soldier who is in need of horizontal refreshment would be well advised to ask a policeman for a suitable address. And it's those 2 words, horizontal refreshment, that nearly cost him his career then and there in November of 1939, because he's crossed the line somehow by using that sort of language. Up to that point, it's all very well, but the fact he employs humour in this order, and I said earlier on that I think Montgomery he's a dryly funny man, actually. He's not the sort of ascetic weirdo that is depicted, really. And the head Catholic chaplain and the head Church of England chaplain in the British Expeditionary Force, go to Lord Gort, the man right at the top of the BEF, and demand that Montgomery be fired. And they have the weight of moral opinion on their side, and they say either he rescinds the order or he's got to go. Now the problem is if he rescinds the order, withdraws the order, then he's lost authority within his division, and he's a busted flush as a divisional commander. Even though he's running the division really well and they're doing good training and he's right on top of it and all this sort of stuff, and he's doing night manoeuvres that no one else is doing, all this sort of thing. And he goes to see Alan Brooke, who's his corps commander, and Alan Brooke, if you're familiar with the Second World War, becomes chief of the Imperial General Staff a couple of years later. He goes to see Alan Brooke, and Alan Brooke basically gets him out of trouble. They have this enormous bollocking, and he's got off the hook for this. And so what you have here is someone trying to be professional about how he's keeping his division in trim, and the sort of powers that be, or the opinion within the army trying to stop him. And I think a big problem in 1939 that runs into 1940, although it isn't the reason that the German invasion of the lowlands and France is such a success, Fall Gel, but I don't think that's the reason it's a success. But it's part of the mindset in the BEF that's the reason they don't know what's hit them. Because they're not really very serious about fighting the Germans. They're not really very serious about the thing they've got in front of them. And the big difference between the German army, they're here in 1939, and the British army in 1939, is the German army is terribly serious about fighting. It may be that it's trained to different. There's lots of arguments about which bits are well trained and which bits are joined up with how they're going to fight in 39-40. There's lots of arguments about how well equipped bits of the German army are. But the main thing is they're up for it, and their generals are really up for it, and the officers that in the German army who understand what that means, they're really up for it too, and that really explains what happens in May 1940 in terms of how that's the head start. They've been thinking about nothing else for 10 years, whereas the British army has been doing counterinsurgency. I mean, Montgomery's career is counterinsurgency in Ireland, Palestine, he's been out in India, he's part of an imperial counterinsurgency force, not an army that's thinking, right, next time we run into the Germans, we're going to have to be really tough all over again. And so but Brooke saves him, because Brooke used to teach at the Staff College at Camberley, and Montgomery is one of his pupils. And there's 24 divisional commanders in the British Army who are students of Brooke's in the British Army. And then there's 19 divisional commanders in the British Army during the Second World War who are Montgomery's pupils at the Staff College. And what you see is that there's a core of people who are really serious, but they don't get full hold of the reins until 1941. And that's kind of, I think, the Montgomery example is illustrative of the sort of the malaise in the British Army and the BEF, the sort of looking in the wrong direction, the worrying about the wrong thing that gets them in such trouble in the 2 or 3 years that then follow the beginning of the war. So that's the Monty chapter. Right? How are we doing for time? Oh, we're doing all right. Great. So then I think we should talk about George Patton. George Patton is a fascinating character. And the really interesting thing about him is he's brilliant with, I mean, he's a movie star, he's an icon, he's a fellow with a shiny helmet with stars on, big speech, George C. Scott in front of a big Stars and Stripes. He's in sort of, kind of just History Channel type history programs, Marty or Patton, who was the better general? It's all that stuff, right? And of course, you're not comparing like with like, Monty ran an army group, Patton was an army commander, they had different responsibilities, tiresome crap. But he's really brilliant, he was really brilliant with words. And one of the fascinating things about Patton is he was dyslexic, he was a sort of self-created warrior. All he wanted to do was go into battle, as he called it. That's all he wanted to do. That's how he wanted to be tested. And he was very pushy, and during the First World War managed to avoid having to do boring things like go and buy horses for the American cavalry, and got himself sent to France, did early art stuff with tanks, with French tanks the Americans had bought, and got right into the sort of the nitty-gritty of the new stuff. And he was a brilliant self-publicist, but a great deal of that came from trying to create this confidence that I was talking about earlier, that his men would have in him. That here was a guy who looked like he knew what he was doing, and who talked the talk, and walked the walk, and carried shiny pistols, and was the American fighting sort of ideal. And, however, and we'll get to how good he was with words in a minute, Patton is a really interesting character because his patronage came from the early days from the 1920s, and he wasn't really in with Marshall and the people running the army by 1940-41. So that he got jobs at all was largely down to his ability to sort of cast a great light on himself. And there's very famous manoeuvres in America called the Louisiana Manoeuvres in 1940 and 41, where the American army practiced in Louisiana and ran these enormous exercises. And Patton made a thing of making sure the newspapers knew what he was doing. He left cash at petrol stations for his tankers to fill up at petrol stations, so that they would win their bit of the exercise. He arrives in the middle of whichever town it is and captures the flag, even though his tank's been killed 5 times, all this sort of stuff. And he doesn't care. He wants the papers to know, and he wants his men to know that they're with this famous general. And that's really, really interesting because he's also really good at his job. He's a brilliant breakout guy. He's really good at picking subordinates. He's really good at having staff that can keep up with his decision making and who've rehearsed the things he's thinking of doing. But he gets into trouble. And the most famous occasion where he gets into trouble is in Sicily. In fact, he is fired in 1943 when he slaps men who have combat fatigue. There's 2 occasions when when he visits field hospitals and he berates men who have combat fatigue. And I'm going to call it that. It's got lots of names: battle shock, PTSD. I mean, which is a completely anachronistic. You can't use that about the Second World War. Shell shock. The American army used to call it nostalgia because the men were wondering about going home, and the good old days before they were being blown to bits. So Patton gets into terrible trouble, and the incident is witnessed by a doctor, by a colonel who's a doctor in the field hospital, and it says. Patton asks this man, Bennett, what the problem was, and Bennett replies, "It's my nerves," and began to sob. The general then screamed at him, "What did you say?" The man replied, "It's my nerves, I can't stand the shelling anymore." He was still sobbing. The general then yelled at him, "Your nerves, hell, you're just a goddamn coward, you yellow son of a bitch." He then slapped the man and shouted and said, "Shut up that goddamn crying. I won't have these brave men who've been shot at seeing a yellow bastard sitting here crying." He then struck the man again, knocking his helmet liner off and into the next tent. He then turned to the admitting officer and yelled, "Don't admit this yellow bastard. There's nothing the matter with him. I don't have the hospitals cluttered up with these sons of bitches who haven't got the guts to fight." Right? Now, Patton he says, "I ought to shoot you myself, you goddamn whimpering coward," is how that encounter ends. Goes for his pistol. Now, the thing is, obviously, that's terrible, right? I'm absolutely not here to go, well, he had a point, right? It's diabolical, but what's interesting about it is it sits in context with what the American Army's done. The American Army, in the run-up, as the Second World War gets going, they have a year where they draft people in 1940, before America's end. Roosevelt's saying there's a world crisis coming. Marshall is building the army up, and they're building up training, and they're reforming the training, and they're trying to shake off the old system that's left over from the Civil War, where a local businessman, a colonel, will raise a regiment around himself in the old style. They want a standardised army. And they're using New Deal things like the Civilian Conservation Corps, experience with that, for getting ordinary people into organised groups and all this sort of stuff. And they're trying to break the tradition and reset it. And one of the things they do, And it's sort of legacy of the First World War. They're not the First World War long enough, really, in combat long enough to really build up a big problem with people with combat fatigue. And one of the things they do is they get all the clever psychologists of the time and psychiatrists of the time who are doused in Freudianism to try and come up with a test that means you fill in the answers and you have an interview and they work out whether you're one of the kind of people who's going to crack in combat. And they medically discharge hundreds of thousands of people on this basis. Hundreds of thousands. And the Freudian sort of pitch is, well, if you've got combat fatigue, it's because you've been reminded of something terrible in your childhood, something traumatic in your childhood, rather than, you know, your best friend has just been blown up or turned into raspberry jam or whatever. It's a really, really interesting mindset and a glimpse into the state of where that kind of thinking was in the 40s. And so Patton is assuming that the men he's got have all passed this test, so there shouldn't be anyone in this state. And the American Army as an institution gets this massive rude awakening in 43, really, where they discover that they put a cap on how long they think men are good for battle, and they think it's 90 days, then it comes down to 60, and then they basically give up putting a number on it because they find out that everyone has different tolerances, but in the end, exhausted men, experienced men, you know, they have a reservoir of courage and it runs out. So Patton has this attitude to combat fatigue and is tangled up in the attitudes of the time in this respect. But a big way that he looks at battle is he sees it in terms of masculinity, in terms of how you express yourself as a man, how a true man is the person that can survive this sort of ordeal of combat. And what's interesting is he is fired, he loses his job, and then is immediately rehired to run 3rd US Army for the breakout phase, the post-invasion phase of the D-Day landings of Operation Overlord. And because that's what he's going to be good at. So they have to fire him, they have to show, because it's a citizen army, because this is the thing that the Americans are up against, is it's a democratic country, they've drafted their citizens. What's the deal between the army and the soldier? They're not volunteers. And the deal is that they're going to look after you. They're going to, and eventually that mutates into the GI Bill and all this sort of stuff, where they do take care of their soldiers. But basically, Patton is completely obsessed. His language, he's brilliant with words, and his language around what it means to be a soldier is so fascinating, and also why you can offer some insight into why he ends up so crazy angry with these people. He says, when you were kids, and he spoke in a high-pitched, when you were kids, yeah, I won't bother. When you were kids, you all admired the assumptions of this are awesome. When you were kids, you all admired the champion marble shooter, the fastest runner, the big league ball players and the toughest boxers. Americans love a winner and they will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war. The very thought of losing is hateful to Americans. Battle is the most significant competition in which a man can indulge. It brings out all that is best and removes all that is base. And this is the stump speech he's giving in the weeks running up to Operation Overlord in the summer of 1944. So he's going round his 1st US Army people, going to see brigades and battalions, regiments and battalions, all this sort of stuff, and delivering this stump speech. And there's a sort of amalgamated version, because there's versions that have been cleaned up and had the bad language taken out, and there's versions that have it in properly. And he said, you know, and he deploys soldierly language. When I want my men to remember something important, to really make it stick, I give it to them double dirty, is what he says. You can't run an army without profanity, and it has to be eloquent profanity. An army without profanity couldn't fight its way out of a piss-soaked paper bag. And he keeps coming back to the idea of what it means to be a man. And this is very interesting, because Montgomery, if we are going to compare, he's not talking like this to British soldiers at all. But then nor is Omar Bradley, who is more of a, if you want to judge Patton against the people who, who are his contemporaries. Bradley isn't talking like this. Bradley's much more homespun. The language is much more down home and much more, don't worry, I'll get you guys home, you can trust me. It's not every man is scared at his first action. If he says he's not, he's a goddamn liar, but the real hero is the man who fights even though he's scared. I mean, I love this stuff. Someone will get their fright over in a minute under fire. Some takes an hour, and for some it takes days. But the real man never lets his fear of death overpower his honour, his sense of duty to his country, and his innate manhood. And this is the language of 1944 in a big chunk of the American army, that it's your innate manhood that's being put to the test. Because the Americans, after all, they've got to find a reason to be fighting in Western Europe. For the lad from Idaho, what on earth is he doing in fighting in Tunisia, Italy, France? There's every chance that his family fled Europe because Europe was all about fighting. America's full of people who detest Europe, did everything they could to get away from it. Is a key thing to remember, I think. And Patton is really, really interesting because he finds this way of mobilising people through oratory as well as through being a very, very aggressive general. And his argument is, if you're super aggressive now, you'll do what you need to do so you don't have to get more men killed later. So anyway, I'm on my 45 minutes. So, 55 minutes, bollocks. I'll tell you what, so there's an illustration of two of the chapters from the book. You'll have to read the others, which involves buying the book, of course. Now, do we have any questions? Yes, on the end there.
I'm just going to bring the microphone to you, but first of all, I'd like to thank Al for a fantastic talk.
Thank you. Thanks very much. We can do 10 minutes of questions before I have to get on the train.
Yeah, that was so good. I felt terrible having to kind of point at my watch, but I know we want to get some questions in before we finish. So, sorry, who's first? Okay. So please hold this close to you.
The camera's had it.
Thanks, Al. A great talk there.
Thank you.
Who didn't make the cut?
Well, I did think about writing about a couple more Americans, but then
no French then?
No French, no, because I just think, as I said at the start, I kind of feel I know my way around the British thing, and then the Americans needed talking about, because the American experience of basically conjuring an army out of nothing. We think of America as this sort of military superpower, but that's the precise opposite of what it was in 1939. I think after Poland's defeated, the American army goes down to being the 17th biggest army in the world or something, from being the 16th. They're not interested. So, but maybe a couple of more Americans. Maybe someone like Matt Ridgway, who's really, really interesting. He's an airborne guy, but I had an airborne guy with Alistair Pearson, so I didn't want to sort of over-egg that. But no, so I mean, the thing is, you could this exercise, you could do another 5 books like this. I think I'm not going to. Well, unless you buy 10 copies each. But.
Okay, I think we've got a question along here. If you could pass the microphone down.
Thank you. Slightly speculative question.
Yeah.
Were perchance Putin to read your book, it's a serious point, do you think there is a single one or perhaps 2 key lessons that he might usefully listen to?
Well, I think the start I was talking about numbers, and numbers being really, really important. And I think what's happened in Ukraine has been proved wrong by that. Is that the Russian army, supposedly with its preponderance of people and kit, was going to steamroll over Ukraine. That didn't happen. And so you can have the numbers and the kit all you like, but it's the software, it's the people, it's how you run it that will make it work, that will mean you do get to Kiev in 3 days or whatever. But I think the other thing is, and this comes from reading people like Roman Topol and Ben Wheatley, who've written about the Kursk battle, is that in Russia it's very hard for anyone to write honest history about Red Army operations in the Second World War. And it seems like over 80 years that not writing honestly about stuff has metastasized into into the way you run an army and a doctrine around the way you run your army, which bears no reality to the experience they had in the Second World War, and has made them come up with all sorts of strange conclusions about how they're going to do things. So I don't know. I mean, I hope he doesn't read the book, you know, in case he figures out how to win. But I think the other thing is we don't really know how militarized Ukraine was in the run-up and how actually well prepared they were and how deep their training had gone and all that sort of stuff. You know, I think we, because of our cultural idea of what the Second World War, like the idea of a plucky nation just hanging on in there by itself, whereas actually that's not quite I don't think that's quite what's happening. If that makes sense.
Thank you. James, do we have a question from Zoom?
We've got one question on Zoom, from Dipali. Did the D-Day landing play a key part?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, until you get there, the disadvantage of trying to fight through Italy is that you can't marshal your shipping in the same way you can 80 miles from Portsmouth. You know, the same way you can coming straight over the Atlantic, you know, round Finisterre and into Normandy. So the Americans, you know, a few weeks into Overlord are shipping men direct from America to Normandy. They're not even bothering going through Britain. You know, the only real way to bring the absolute full weight of the Allied war machine is to do it in northern France in the end, and also it's a shorter trip to Berlin or to Germany. But yes, absolutely yes. But yeah, there is the completely inexorable strategic logic to you having to do that, and when they do it as well.
Okay, questions in the room? Any more?
One more, come on, someone. Yes.
Monty or Patton? Who was greater?
Well, Monty was given D-Day to run. Patton was asked to turn up after it had happened. Draw your own conclusions. No, seriously though. Patton never had to deal with any of the political stuff that Montgomery had to deal with. Montgomery, once Overlords happened and once there are more American troops in theatre than there are British or Duke troops in theatre, once it reaches that point, the British need the war to end as quickly as possible so that they can have as much clout in the peace that follows. And so that is the thing that Monty's having to deal with politically, and to massage and get through SHAEF and get through decision making post-Overlord. And also there are V2s on London and V1s on London. I think we tend to forget that the highest casualty month for the British in the Second World War is June of 1944, and that's because it's Overlord and Italy and the V-weapons blitz all happening all at once. And there's massive political pressure on Montgomery to do something about the V-weapons, and the thing to do about the V-weapons is to take all of Holland, take the lowlands, take the Netherlands, and then the problem's solved. And so he's under that political pressure from London that is coming round to him, not via SHAEF, from Churchill and Brooke, and then he's got to go back to SHAEF and say, I need to do my decisions in your bigger context, please, Ike. And that's how you end up doing a thing like Market Garden, because of those enormous pressures, and their political pressures. Patton never had to deal with any of that. He never had to worry about what his government was thinking, or worry about what the British government might be thinking. It never crossed his mind. And he'd have been terrible at that if it had come to it. Really
obviously, I haven't read your book yet, but
great,
because I didn't even know it was for sale. You've touched on the politics of war. You've also touched in your talk this evening about effectively soldiers being constituents of a general.
Yes.
And the general has to have their trust.
Yep.
They have to know that he has their well-being at heart. And they need to know that he's not going to squander their lives meaninglessly, which was a kind of feeling about the First World War. There are two things I'm quite interested in. I've been, if your book touched on it, it'd be great. One is, it's not how the British learned, or the Allies learned how to win a war, it's how they forgot in 1919-1920.
Yeah.
because, as you know, Montgomery actually commanded an armoured division in the 1930s, which was then disbanded by the British, which probably would have taken on the Germans in Flanders in 1940 had we still had it. Therefore, my question really is, how did we forget, not how did we learn?
Well, that's a brilliant question, and I know that Rob Lyman and Richard Dannant have written a book. I think it's Richard Dannant. Have written a book that's going to address that fairly shortly. But basically, end of the First World War. Everyone thinks, well, thank God that's over.
Should I wait and buy that?
No, don't. I'm about to save you £25. End of the First World War. Everyone thinks, well, gosh, that was awful. That better not happen again. And that thinking turns into that won't happen again because it's unthinkable. How could anyone ever, find themselves in that situation again? Just as the deterrence of an industrial war fails in the run-up to the First World War, the First World War then becomes the deterrent, as it were, for fighting a European land war in British political circles. Everyone's broke, Great Depression, all these things all happening at once in the 3-4 years that follow the First World War. The British Empire finds itself bigger than it's ever been. The greatest reach of the British Empire is post the First World War, post the Great War, where they take hold of German possessions and stuff. And the Treasury says, well, we've all agreed we're never going to do this again, so we won't do this again. So the army had better downscale, and the army goes back to its counterinsurgency function, goes back to being a coin thing. So the Indian Army, which is the British Army's shadow army, and the Indian government has to pay the same amount that the British Army costs the British government. They have to spend that on the Indian Army, same amount. Does things in the Hindu Kush. One of the generals in here, Francis Tuker, he learns his stuff in a thing called the Cookie Punitive Expedition in the Assam Hills in 1920-21, where he has to fight people with muskets and figures out how to defeat them because they've forgotten, because they've been doing First World War stuff, they've forgotten how to fight the locals. And what happens is the army abandons its plan to have a staff college like West Point, a university like West Point, abandons that in like 1922, ditches its reform of officer recruitment, so goes back to it just being chaps from basically 5 public schools rather than everyone. And in the Second World War, it's properly democratised, so people from all classes have the opportunity to be killed at a very high rate as subalterns. And it gets forgotten because there's no need to think like that anymore, is the way it's seen. Winston Churchill, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, brings in the 10-year rule, which says there will not be a continental land war for 10 years. Picks the number out of the hat as a politician, because he's being a politician in I think it's 1990 or 20, I can't remember when the 10-year rule was enacted, but basically he's being a politician. He's saying, look, we're not going to spend any money on a thing like this for another 10 years. And you've also got the jostling within the inter-service thing where the Air Force goes, well, we can do this cheaper than the Army by sending biplanes and bombing villages in Iraq and getting them in line. And they offer to do it with tech rather than boots on the ground. And the Navy is allowed to lay down a new hull at its own rate. And the Navy, because it's the senior service, sort of retains basically the best muscle memory. But the Army isn't seen as cool. The generals are seen as profligate and insensitive, so no one cares. And that's how it gets forgotten. It gets gobbled up in politics, imperial requirements, and you could see a parallel with the British Army now has done lots of coin, to what end I don't know, but has probably forgotten how to do interstate warfighting. I hate the word warfighting, but that kind of fighting that you might need to do now if Ukraine needed help. You know what I mean?
But in 1918, the British Army had actually developed all armed forces.
Oh, yeah.
They were coordinated.
Yep.
The air, the land.
Yep. And for the Plan 1919 included armoured personnel carriers and a whole armoured fist thing that they were going to develop and everything. And they just went, well, thank God we haven't got to do that anymore. You could see why that would appeal to people. Yeah. Anyway, I think that answers your question.
That was a very good question and a very comprehensive answer. I'd love to take some more questions, but unfortunately, if we do that, I think Al will miss his train. So I would say, if you enjoyed the the sort of textured portraits of the generals that Al you gave in his talk, I'd highly recommend the book because all of the characters featured have that level of kind of anecdotal, textual, nuanced portrayal, and it's a really good read. So finally, let's give our thanks again to Al Murray.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. And check out the podcast. I've been told I have to say that. Thanks to Joe, everyone.